So that leads us, when we're talking about scheduling, to a team that has a number of ranked wins on their schedule, and partially because the men of Troy got their AP Top 25 ranking this weekend, and after their win. So Clemson has wins over Auburn, Troy, and Louisville, and Florida State, but managed to lose and give up 43 points to a Pitt team that's been hit or miss all year long. So let's dive right into this one, plow right through it. People were surprised, but not really, because Clemson has these games. They've got, I think they were 5-0 coming into this game in one-score games. So you felt something was going to give, and it did give against Pitt. What did we see here? And is it Clemson not the same Clemson they were last year, or maybe this was just to stub their toe on the way to the playoffs?
I don't know how you can look at Clemson this year and say that they're the same Clemson they were last year, frankly. They aren't generating the points. They're not dominating, their competition. They were so good last year. I mean, so good. Most year, I feel so good. Oh my Lord, I sound like Donald Trump. But
they were huge.
Yeah, huge wins all over the place. But last year Clemson won almost all their games by double digits. They had the close game against Notre Dame, it was 24-22. But then they win the next game by 20. Then they win the next game by 17, by 58, by 15, by 10, by 10, by 20. And then they had a bizarre 5-point win against South Carolina, close ACC championship game, blow out Oklahoma, and have a high-scoring game against Alabama. But for most of that season, they were dominant. This year ain't so dominant. I mean, just one-score win over Auburn, one-score win over Troy, one-score win over Louisville, overtime win over North Carolina State, one-score win over Florida State, lost to Pitt. Most of their games have been close, and there's a recursive problem we have when we watch these teams, and I will say, a lot of people will say college football is down right now. I don't think that's really necessarily the case. The problem is there's not any parity, and when there isn't much, parity, and there's not a lot of good teams to compare data points, we start assuming that, say, North Carolina State is a pretty good team because they took Clemson to overtime, who was undefeated. And it's really hard to say, is that really true, or is Clemson just marginally better than these other teams to the point where they can win consistently? There is no answer to that question for what it's worth, but there was only really one team that we felt like could challenge Clemson and give us a strong indication of how good they were. That was Louisville, and the other was Florida State. But Florida State has been, utterly shaky all year. So, I don't think they're the same team they were last year. Watching them, I think their offensive line has really significant issues. The defense is actually still pretty darn good, and you can tell the talent differential there defensively versus the other teams in their conference for the most part. But it's still a young defense. It may be talented, but it is young. And last year's Clemson defense was at times exceptional. And I think everybody focuses on Clemson's offense last year, but their defense had a lot of, like, Florida State game, a lot of really dominant performances, really kept I think Notre Dame last year, as bad as they were this year, they really were that good last year, and they were just a couple plays away from, being in the playoff, as much as I think people forget that. But it was Clemson's defense that really won them a lot of games. And this year, I mean, they're good enough to put a lot of pressure on people, but they're also, they've given up 30 points or more, 3 times already this season. It's not quite at the same level it was last year.
What I've really found kind of shocking in this year's Clemson team is their inability to run the ball, and I don't think people understand or realize that it's kind of a struggle for them. Wayne Gallman has 3 100-yard games this year. He had 2 games into October last year. Like he had 3 in the month of October, 4 in the month of October. So the guy isn't running as well, and I think there's something to that because nobody on the team is running as well. Watson's not getting as many yards, and he's having to throw it. I think he threw it 70 times against Pitt. So speak a little bit about that in terms of everybody thinks of this Clemson offense running through Deshaun Watson and running through his arm specifically because he is a good thrower and he can do the 580 yards like he did Saturday. But talk about how even when you have a quarterback like that, if you're not getting the production in the run game, even in that style of offense, how it can really shut things down.
Right. It was pretty obvious in the Auburn game in the opener that the Clemson offensive line was not, did not resemble what it was last year. We never know with stuff like this what's going to happen. The problem is when you lose, an offensive guard and a center or maybe a tackle, you just don't know who he's going to be replaced with. Sometimes you replace him with a player that may not have been all that well rated, but he may be better than the guy he was before. Alabama, a lot of the reasons they are what they are this year, they lose their right tackle, Dominic Jackson, who struggled in the Clemson game, hence why I'm bringing this up. But they replace him with a 5-star recruit in Jonah Williams, who, as it turns out, may be the best lineman on the team year one. And Clemson, in comparison, lost a lot of interior lineman players, and the replacements are just bad. And they got dominated up front by Auburn. And there were a lot of plays that they made in, like the national championship last season. Their downfield throws to receivers on these streaks and seams. They simply do not have the time to run those plays. And because they can't generate a run game, because the interior line's getting blown up, they're constantly in bad down and distance. So it's a double whammy, right? If you're on 3rd and 5, 3rd and 4 with a quarterback like Watson, there are a whole boatload of plays, little pick plays, slants, drags you can run to get the ball out quickly and get a first down. When it's 3rd and 10, you need time. And the same reason you ended up in 3rd and 10 was because the offensive line's struggling, so you don't have time. And that I think is really the key to Clemson this season. As much as Watson's mobile, I think Watson struggled a little bit. I think the receivers, for whatever reason, have struggled a lot. I've seen a lot more drops than we saw last year. But it is a continuing trend with these styles of offense because they tend to. You almost don't need phenomenal receivers. I mean, you need good receivers, and great receivers make a big difference. But we're kind of seeing this. We're seeing this, not kind of. We're really seeing this with Ole Miss. Because you're in a lot of 5-man protections, if your offensive line really struggles, you're in bad down and distance constantly. And if your offensive line is struggling, you give up a tremendous amount of pressure. So whether it be Texas A&M or Ole Miss or Clemson, those same offenses, all three of them in the past 4 years, at one point or another, one of those three teams was the most explosive offense in football when they had a good line. And with a bad line, they were among the worst offenses in football.
And people are going to say, well, look, Clemson scored 42 points in this game, so you can't blame it on the offense. But they also scored 17 against NC State in regulation. They scored 19 on Auburn, struggled with Troy. There's been games this year where they haven't been able to score. And in this game, because they couldn't run, they had 2 yards per carry. So 2 yards per carry against a team that gave up 51 to Miami, 39 to Virginia Tech. Pitt's not got a good defense. 2 yards per carry means you have to throw it 70 times, and you throw 3 interceptions, and I think a couple of them were in the Pitt red area. So it all comes together. And yes, they scored 42 points, but with a run game, maybe they score 49 points and they keep their defense on the sidelines and don't give up 43. So sometimes it looks like there's not these weaknesses on a side of the ball where they're, playing really well defensively or they're scoring a lot of points, but you got to look a little bit deeper. And, it's frustrating probably if you're a Clemson fan to have this be the game you lose this late in the season, but because everybody else lost Saturday besides Alabama and Wisconsin, talk about how this game may end up, well, maybe not just this game, but like for Michigan, Clemson, and Washington, how all three of them could lose this Saturday, but because all three of them lost this Saturday, it may mean none of them matter.
Right. I think it's absolutely true. I mean, the playoff implications here, right? When you look at the pecking order, you try to wonder who's 3 and who's 4 and who's 5, and one team jumps another team, but they're in a big bunch, right? I mean, there are, there's those 5 teams with one loss: Ohio State, Louisville, Michigan, Washington, Clemson, and Washington. Of those teams with one loss, all the ones that didn't have a loss lost, and that was right. Michigan, Clemson, and Washington. And all that did was Alabama was already number one. They were going to stay number one as long as they stayed undefeated. When those 3 teams lost a game, they just fell back into the other pool of teams that only had one loss, and there were only 2 of them: Ohio State and Louisville. Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Penn State, the next teams back. There's a freaking gap there. And I know, the AP poll I think has Wisconsin ahead of Washington. I'll be surprised if it stays that way. I guess, well, I won't be so surprised, but Washington will easily make that jump back up if they play in and win a conference championship game, in my opinion. But for the rest of them, Clemson, Louisville, Clemson has the head-to-head over Louisville. Clemson is still slated to play in the conference championship game. The college football playoff rankings is going to give it a big jump for that. And considering Louisville's schedule is laughably weak, I'm sorry, but it is. And they have no fault. There's no one they can point their finger at but themselves for a complete failure to really schedule anybody of strength out of conference. They scheduled Houston, but as it turns out, Houston's probably not going to end up being a very good football team. They start with Charlotte. So Clemson's probably going to end up ahead of Louisville, which all that matters. Michigan and Ohio State play each other, so that one's going to be resolved. One of them's going to be 2 loss. Washington has a chance to win a conference championship game. And, Wisconsin can't win, again, a conference championship game without beating either Ohio State or Michigan. So you're going to end up with the same darn teams you had to start with. The only thing is maybe their gap has fallen from the teams behind them, but I don't see any way Oklahoma jumps the teams in front of them. Maybe there's an outside argument for Penn State, but yeah, that and Penn State gets stronger right with Pitt beating Clemson. That was a huge thing for Penn State. They're probably the one team that really benefits from that, and it's because of who they lost to. But for the rest of them, I don't think it really matters.
So it's weird because you can't remember a time where you've had this many big losses this late in the season where it really didn't matter. But I kind of like it that way, and I'll tell you why. I hate this concept that we all subscribe to that a loss in November matters differently than a loss in late September. Like everybody, I don't think it's fair that if you happen to have the best team on your schedule in September, you can lose to them and work your way back up throughout the year. Well, if the other team that lost in November had their best team on their schedule at the end of the year and they lost, they get punished more for it. I think that's asinine. So if you finish the season 11-1 and you get left out just because your schedule was backloaded or the timing of when somebody played somebody in a different conference on the other side of the country, but they lost in September, that's stupid. So we need to get out of this mindset of it's all relative ranking, right? We start with preseason polls and then we just shuffle everything down. Every time somebody loses, we shuffle back and forth, and then everything's related to where everybody was ranked the week before. And that is lazy and stupid, and I'm not going to get into another rankings rant, but I think that's crazy. So I'm glad for once that the pollsters' hands are tied, that they can't punish somebody for losing in November only to have a team with the same record and a weaker schedule ranked ahead of them because they happened to lose 2 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Why did Texas A&M gets blown out by Mississippi State, and I don't think this really got enough clout. They only dropped from 4 to 8. They stayed ahead of Auburn, who, and I think it was because A&M beat Auburn. And they stay ahead of Penn State. They stay ahead of Oklahoma. They're giving a lot of credit to not just what your record is, but who have you beaten? because there's always a lot of talk in college football that such and such ain't played nobody. If you've only got, two or three strong teams in a conference, no matter how good they are, if you're a solid team, if you only play two of them, you're only guaranteed, even if you aren't nearly as good as those other two, you're still going to finish 10-2. Or if maybe you only play one of the other two, and if you finish 11-1, it doesn't mean anything. And it kind of relates to your point too about early and late in the season. Let's say you have three great teams in a division, and this happens a lot. You have, let's say, and we're just playing with divisions here, but we see a lot Auburn, Alabama, LSU, or we see Ohio State and Michigan and somebody else. If those three teams play early and in a round robin they all lose to each other, like you said, we forget about it and it moves on later. If they play late in the season and they all lose to each other, we really punish them because they don't have a chance to move back. But what does it matter if they all lose to each other? That just means they're all equally good. It doesn't mean they're good compared to the rest of the country. It doesn't mean they're bad to the rest of the country. It just means they're equally good. So they shouldn't really, in that situation where you have three teams, they shouldn't be punished for how they win or lose relative to any other team in any other conference. Because the fact that they lose to each other has no freaking relevance to how good they are versus any other team.
I completely agree, and I think we've already beaten it up a little bit, but it is so cool to see just all of the possible scenarios. And again, this is what I talked about after the A&M 4th, Washington 5th thing. Partially, it plays itself out, right? We see this every year. It plays itself out, but also this is like a really cool, fun scenario that we're discussing right now in real life because of what happened on Saturday that was completely unprecedented. I think it hadn't happened since 1985. We need to enjoy these discussions and this cool stuff we can talk about and discuss how the scenarios are going to play out throughout the year with what we have left, and not just try to fast forward to the end and see who's going to be in the playoffs, So there's a good bit of football left to play. I have a feeling one of these teams is going to drop another one. It might be Washington against Washington State. We'll see.
Somebody we never discussed, and it's comical. West Virginia, one loss. And it's sad that I don't even count them. I mean, how the Big 12 just needs to be finding a way to take their conference commissioner out to pasture because of how much they could have benefited from this chaos and how little they will from the lack of teams in the championship game.
Well, and it's funny because nobody's even discussing the Big 12. Like, once Oklahoma, everybody realized that they weren't going to make it, they just kind of fell off the map. So, and we are actually going to discuss West Virginia in our preview show this weekend. So come back for that if you really care about the Big 12, and I know you do. So that's our review show for this week. It was very interesting. Check out the other games that we've covered if you want. We talked about the games in the review, but we also got into some of the minutia and the details of rankings and conferences overall. So there's some interesting discussions there. So keep an eye out, obviously, for the preview weekend. We're actually going back to the 3-game model, so you'll see that this week. So thanks so much, y'all, and have a good early part of your week.